Welcome to Miyconst Hardware. I have got the famous human malware and I feel completely drained, so I apologize for the voice. Yet I managed to assemble this computer, which is basically a laptop inside this beautiful Cooler Master NR200 chassis. I have here mobile Intel Core i7-11800H CPU and mobile AMD GPU, that is AMD Radeon RX 6600M. In this video I'm going to tell you about the test results of this Maxsun HM570 motherboard with the soldered i7-11800H CPU. But first, let me take it down so it doesn't bother me. As always, I have got myself a little printout with the most important pros and cons about the Maxsun HM570 motherboard, and let me start with the cons first. As usual, I was able to identify that the motherboard does not support the sleep mode. Yes, even though it is a much newer Intel platform, Chinese still didn't manage to make the sleep mode working. With the most Chinese X79 and X99 motherboards, it is possible to send your computer to sleep, but the computer would not wake up. In case of Maxsun HM570, this feature is completely disabled and Windows would not let you go into the sleep mode at all. Another problem is the custom-made IHS for the CPU. i7-11800H is a mobile CPU that doesn't come with an IHS from Intel. That's why to be able to install the standard LGA1200 CPU coolers, Chinese had to make a custom-made IHS. Unfortunately, this IHS is slightly higher than the standard Intel CPU package, and that means it is not possible to install the box coolers from Intel. Attempting to click on this box cooler onto the motherboard will result into a bent motherboard, thus I do not recommend to do that. Still, it is possible to use any other standard LGA1200 CPU cooler that either uses the screws to mount itself or that uses clip-on mechanism. In my case, I used the cheapest possible Chinese clip-on LGA1200 CPU cooler and it works just fine. Speaking of the custom-made IHS, I can also mention that it feels like the thermal interface between the IHS and the CPU itself is not the best. The heat transfer from the CPU to the IHS is somehow restricted. Still, it's not that big of an issue because the mobile i7-11800H doesn't consume more than 65 watts of electricity. Then I also have some bad news about overclocking. i7-11800H is a locked CPU, and with HM570 motherboard it is not possible to increase the memory clock frequency to anything more than DDR4 3200. DDR4 3200 is the official Intel specification, and you cannot go beyond that. It's not that big of an issue because DDR4 3200 is already good enough, but still we have this limitation. Intel X2U also doesn't work to do any sorts of control of the CPU. The program simply refuses to start because it doesn't recognize the platform and you can't do anything with it. Inside the BIOS there are settings to adjust the CPU TDP level. By default the CPU is restricted to 45 watt, but these settings are completely ignored. It's also not that big of an issue because we have such an awesome program called Throttle Stop, and we can use Throttle Stop to adjust the CPU TDP levels right in the Windows. And with this positive note, I will go into the pros of the motherboard. And the pros are also coming from the BIOS. The BIOS is not that bad after all. We have out-of-the-box RAM timings, we also have support for the XMP profile, and we can undervolt the CPUs right in the BIOS. Another very positive side of Maxsun HM570 motherboard is the support for PCI Express 4.0 speed. The PCI Express X16 slot and the first M.2 slots are both supporting PCI Express 4.0 connectivity. So if you have only one SSD, then I recommend connecting it to the first M.2 slot, because that one is connected straight to the CPU, it supports PCI Express 3.0 and 4.0 SSDs. The second M.2 slot is connected to the chipset and the maximum speed is PCI Express 3.0 x4. The motherboard is also fully compatible with Windows 11, and that means that the TPM 2.0 module is working just fine. I can also mention that Maxsun HM570 is using slightly better audio codec compared to the cheapest Realtek ALC667. In this case we have Realtek ALC897, and even I can hear the difference between these two. Another not less important feature is the VRM, or the power delivery system. Even though the VRM itself is rather pathetic, it is more than enough for i7-11800H that does not consume more than 65 watt of TDP. Finally, the last very positive thing, especially for me, is that Maxsun HM570 fits inside Cooler Master NR200 chassis. Cooler Master NR200 is slightly bigger than the standard Mini IDX chassis. The standard Mini IDX chassis are coming with either 1 or 2 expansion slots, while Cooler Master NR200 comes with the 3 expansion slots, and Maxsun HM570 motherboard also comes with the 3 expansion slots. So we have PCI Express X16 and PCI Express X1. The X1 is connected through the chipset, but it is still very nice to have this extra slot that you can use inside the Cooler Master NR200 chassis. You can either install an extra Wi-Fi card, or maybe extra USB ports, or maybe extra SATA ports if you wish to. These were the most important pros and cons about Maxsun HM570 with the soldered i7-11800H, but before I go into the test results, let me mention a few extra details. First, even though the motherboard has 2 M.2 slots, it does not support SATA M.2 SSDs. It only supports PCI Express and NVMe SSDs, so if you have a SATA SSD, you would need to figure out how to connect it through some kind of an adapter. The Smart Fan function on Maxsun HM570 works, but just like any other Chinese motherboard, it is limited to only 4-pin PWM fans connected to the 4-pin PWM headers. Maxsun HM570 has 2 4-pin headers and 1 3-pin header. The 3-pin header is not controlled and not monitored in any way. The 4-pin fan headers can be controlled inside the BIOS, and what's good is that you can adjust the rotation speed for 2 headers individually, but as with any other Chinese motherboard, only 4-pin PWM fans can adjust their rotation speed. Finally, a few words about the performance. Core i7-11800H is a locked CPU, with a maximum clock frequency of 4.6 GHz and maximum boost for all 8 cores is 4.2 GHz. 4.2 GHz is only achievable if the CPU doesn't hit the TDP limitation first. In my case, I had to increase the TDP limit to 65 Watt using the throttle stop application to achieve 4.2 GHz on all 8 cores. But after I apply 50 mV undervolting, the CPU power consumption drops to 55 watts, and the CPU maintains 4.2 GHz on all 8 cores even under Cinebench R23 load, and with this, the CPU consumes only about 55 Watt of electricity, and I find it rather fascinating. This mobile CPU is very efficient. So the CPU clock frequency is rather good, but how about the memory? As I have already mentioned, DDR4 3200 is the maximum we can achieve with this motherboard and this CPU. Maxsun HM570 motherboard is also restricted to only 2 memory slots. Thus, all my tests in the past would be a little bit like apples to oranges, since when we have 4 memory modules, or rather 4 memory ranks, we are getting better performance, especially in games, compared to just 2 memory ranks, and in this case memory ranks equal to memory modules because I have single rank memory modules. If you're interested to understand how it works and what's going on, then I suggest you to watch a very good video with some tests from Hardware Unboxed. The link you will of course find in the video description. But for now we have what we have. I am limited to only 2 memory slots, so I am forced to test with the 2 by 8 GB, so it's only 16 gigs of memory instead of 32 gigs. With i7 and i3 CPUs, I'm going to compare my i7-11800H. It is also known that Intel Core 11th generation is suffering from the increased memory latency. To somehow equalize these test configurations, I have also tightened the secondary timings after applying the XMP profile of my memory sticks. With this, memory latency is slightly better, but still not awesome. Okay, now it's time for some synthetic benchmarks. Here, unfortunately, I do not have my own test results for i5-12400, but I have picked up some scores from the internet, and even though I use reputable sources that you can trust, I still recommend to use these numbers as just a base comparison and a base understanding of the performance level between i5-12400 and i7-11800H. Starting with the Cinebench R23 as usual. When only one CPU core is utilized, then the newest i5-12400 is taking the first place, 1710 points. i7-11800H is not that far behind though, 1519 points. i5-2666V3 that has much lower CPU clock frequency scores only 828 points. When all CPU cores are at use, 8-core i7-11800H takes the lead. It scores 13,733 points. i5-12400 scores just above 12,000 points, and 10-core i5-2666V3 is not even able to reach the 10,000 point mark. It scores about 9,730 points. Testing Geekbench 5, we can see very similar but still slightly different result. When using just one CPU core, i5-12400 and i7-11800H score almost identically. Both of the CPUs are getting about 1,620 points. But when using all CPU cores, 10-core Xeon E5 is able to outpace 6-core i5. i5 scores only 7,900 points, while i5-2666V3 scores 8,700 points. 8-core i7-11800H with the turbo boost up to 4.2 GHz scores almost 9,500 points. In Blender, i7-11800H is yet again taking the first place. It scores 202 points. 6-core i5-12400 scores 170 points, and 10-core i5-2666V3 is only able to achieve 161 points. V-Ray benchmark confirms the previous results. Core i7-11800H takes the first place. It scores just a bit more than 10,000 points. i5-12400 scores just under 9,400 points, and the Xeon E5-2666V3 is only able to achieve 7,600 points. The last tested benchmark is Speedometer. Here we validate CPU performance in a web browser. Core i7-11800H and Core i5-12400 score about the same, 254 and 255 points. In all these synthetic benchmarks, we can see that Core i7-11800H is a really nice productivity CPU, and if we keep in mind that the CPU is consuming less than 55 watts of electricity, then we can see that it not only delivers good performance, but it is also very efficient. Now it's time for some gaming benchmarks. Here I use my own results that I have conducted myself using my own hardware. But unfortunately, I do not have capacity to retest all of the CPUs with all the latest updates, with the latest version of Windows, with the latest drivers from AMD for my RX 6800 XT, and with all the game patches installed. So these numbers might not be extremely accurate, but they are still good to understand the general level of performance of i7-11800H. Starting with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we are getting disappointed. i7-11800H is not even able to match i5-2666V3. i7 is rendering 85 and 129 FPS, while Xeon E5 is able to render 86 and 137 FPS. i3-12100 and i7-12700K are able to deliver about 100–140 FPS. I don't know what exactly is going on here, but I have tested and retested my i7-11800H configuration just to get exactly the same result. I can only assume that Assassin's Creed Valhalla is very sensitive to the memory performance, and because i7-11800H has only 2 memory modules with a rather high memory latency, we're getting lower gaming performance. Unlike Assassin's Creed, Far Cry 6 uses only 1.5 CPU cores. So here i7-11800H is pulling ahead of the Xeon, but it is still not able to match i3-12100. i7-11800H scores 85 and 110 FPS, while i3-12100 delivers 89 and 122 FPS. i7-12700K is much faster, 120 and 157 FPS. Rainbow Six extraction, and yet again i7-11800H is not able to match i3-12100. The gap is rather small, but it's still there. i7 delivers 189 and 257 FPS, while i3 is able to render 192 and 260 FPS. Watch Dogs Legion is a very CPU-demanding game, and here 8-core i7-11800H is able to outpace i3-12100. i7 renders 82 and 111 FPS, while i3-12100 delivers 71 and 99 FPS. Core i7-12700K is much faster, 100 and 140 FPS. F1 2021, and here i7-11800H and i3-12100 are delivering very similar performance. The minimal FPS number is slightly better with the i7, 269 and 325 FPS compared to 252 and 324 FPS. i7-12700K is yet again much faster, 308 and 384 FPS. Hitman 3 is another game where i7-11800H struggles to keep up with the i3-12100, 24 and 227 FPS in comparison to 53 and 240 FPS. Here it's important to mention that the minimal FPS number is very random with the Hitman 3 benchmark, thus we better compare the average FPS, but still even on average, i3-12100 is better than i7-11800H. And once again, i7-12700K is far better, 95 309 FPS. Horizon Zero Dawn is another very CPU-demanding game. It can use many CPU cores, but at the same time it also likes when the CPU has strong IPC or strong performance on a single core. So once again, i7-11800H is not able to match i3-12100, 116 and 168 FPS compared to 125-178 FPS with the Core i3. Core i7-12700K in this game is just tiny bit faster, 132-186 FPS. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a very similar game to Horizon Zero Dawn when it comes to the CPU requirements, and we have a very similar result. i7-11800H is slightly slower, 100 and 140 FPS compared to 104-147 FPS with i3-12100. With Core i7-12700K we are getting much better results, 132-179 FPS. The last tested game is Total War 3 Kingdoms, and this is another disappointment for i7-11800H. It is only able to roughly match the performance of e5-2666v3, 120-137 FPS compared to 127-167 FPS with the Core i3-12100. Core i7-12700K is yet again significantly faster, 192-209 FPS. Overall, the gaming performance of i7-11800H is worse than I expected, but it is still not bad. Roughly, it equals to i3-12100. So if you're looking for a CPU that does both gaming and productivity, then i7-11800H could be your option. Finally, let's talk about the power consumption. Here I report power consumption of entire system and not just the CPU. So let's start with the Cinebench R23 test. Here my system with the Xeon E5-2666v3 consumes about 215 watts, and the systems with Core i5-12400 and Core i7-11800H consume about the same amount of power. Core i5 system takes 161 watts and Core i7 system takes 162 watts. If I convert these numbers to milliwatts for a single Cinebench R23 point, then Xeon E5-2666v3 requires 22.1 milliwatts for a single point. Core i5-12400 system requires 13.39 milliwatts for a single point. And the Core i7-11800H system consumes 11.8 milliwatts for a single Cinebench R23 point. As we can see in this test, Core i7-11800H is the most efficient CPU. The efficiency is even better than Core i5-12400, and the outdated Xeon E5-2666v3 is really not that efficient compared to the modern CPUs. Under gaming conditions, when running Assassin's Creed Valhalla benchmark, system with E5-2666v3 consumes about 385 watts. The system with Core i3-12100 consumes about 340 watts, and the system with Core i7-11800H consumes about 316 watts. It's important to mention that under gaming conditions, your graphics card will be the one that consumes the most power. And since Core i3-12100 is able to render more frames, then the graphics card consumes more power. That's why, even though Core i3-12100 system consumes more power than Core i7-11800H system, we are still getting almost identical efficiency, and actually in this case it's exactly identical. Both of the systems require 2.45 watts to render one frame, and if we compare it to Xeon E5-2666v3, it requires 2.81 watts to render single frame. After collecting all these test results, I got really surprised, both positively and negatively. Core i7-11800H with all 8 cores running at 4.2 GHz and consuming just 55 Watt of electricity is a really nice productivity CPU. Still, when it comes to gaming, I expected much better results. All in all, this 8-core CPU is performing somewhere around Core i3-12100, and Core i3-12100 is a quad-core CPU, while i7-11800H is an 8-core CPU. So we can see that the 12th generation from Intel is significantly better for gaming than the 10th and 11th gen. And with this, we come to a natural conclusion that if you're looking to assemble a budget gaming computer, then Core i3-12100 would be a better option. Nevertheless, I have really enjoyed this Maxsun HM570 motherboard with i7-11800H, especially because it perfectly fits in this nice Cooler Master and R200 chassis, and I got myself basically laptop inside the chassis. Combined with, of course, the AMD Radeon RX 6600M, I got a really nice and cool build. Thus, if you're like me, who like to assemble different kind of weird projects and you enjoy small and neat solutions, then it might be an interesting option for you. Overall though, Maxsun HM570 could be a viable alternative to the other popular motherboard CPU combos if the price would be right. Unfortunately, the price is far from right at the moment. In my case, I had to pay about 360 euros for this combo, because I had to pay for the delivery and also the Swedish VAT on imported goods. With this money, I would much rather buy Core i3-12100 or Core i5-12400 with a cheap H610 or B660 motherboard, and that's exactly what I would recommend to you. Still, as I have already said, if you're looking for something unique for your hobby project, or in your area prices for i3-12100 and i5-12400 are outrageous, then this Maxsun HM570 motherboard with a soldered i7-11800H could be a viable option. Just always make sure to check your local prices, check your second-hand, and pick the best option for you. Right now, as it stands, this i7-11800H is a very bad value. Still, it is a very interesting and attractive proposition if you just want to play around with it, or you want to assemble something like this, which is a laptop and a desktop form factor. With this, I have to say thanks for watching, thanks for listening, I hope it was interesting and educational. Bye for now!